While you're watching this video, China is quietly executing the most sophisticated economic takeover in modern history, and it's happening through something as mundane as the battery in your phone. Right now, at this very moment, 90% of the rare earth elements that power every piece of technology around you are being processed in Chinese facilities, giving Beijing more control over American lives than most people realize. But here's what the corporate reports buried deep in SEC filings don't want you to know. This isn't just about batteries anymore. It's about who controls the future of human civilization itself. You see, while Americans argue about gas prices and inflation, China has been playing a completely different game for the past 2 decades. They've systematically cornered the market on every single material needed for the green energy transition, from the lithium in Tesla batteries to the cobalt in your laptop. And they've done it so methodically that even Pentagon analysts admit we're facing what they call strategic material dependency. But what leaked documents from major automakers reveal goes far beyond what anyone imagined possible. Let me walk you through exactly how this happened, because the timeline reads like a geopolitical thriller that's been hiding in plain sight. Back in 2001, while America was focused on the Middle East, China made a decision that seemed insignificant at the time. They started buying up small mining operations in Africa, specifically in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 70% of the world's cobalt sits underground. Fast forward to today, and Chinese companies now own or control 80% of critical mineral production in the DRC. But here's the part that should terrify every American. Cobalt isn't just used in batteries. It's essential for fighter jets, missiles, and every piece of military hardware that keeps this country safe. The numbers are staggering when you actually dig into the data that rarely makes headlines. China processes 60% of the world's lithium, despite producing only 13% of it. Think about that for a second. They take raw materials from Australia, Chile, and other countries, ship them to China for processing, then sell the refined materials back to the world at whatever price they choose. It's like letting one country control all the world's oil refineries, while everyone else just digs crude out of the ground. But the lithium story gets even more disturbing when you realize what happened in July of this year. Chinese lithium futures prices surged 14% in a single week, then crashed dramatically when Beijing stepped in with regulatory intervention. That wasn't market volatility. That was a demonstration of power. China was showing the world that they can manipulate the price of the material that powers every electric vehicle, every smartphone, every piece of technology that defines modern life. And they did it with surgical precision, just to prove they could. But cobalt is where the story gets really dark, and this is information that somehow never makes it into mainstream news coverage. In February of this year, the Democratic Republic of Congo implemented export restrictions on cobalt. And by July, China's cobalt imports had dropped 72% year over year. You'd think that would cripple Chinese battery production, right? Wrong. China maintained stable cobalt exports throughout the entire period, which means they had massive strategic stockpiles that nobody knew about. They've been preparing for supply disruptions for years, while American companies were caught completely off guard. Here's where it gets personal for every American watching this. Remember the Inflation Reduction Act that was supposed to boost American EV production? The one with $370 billion in incentives? Well, there's a clause buried in that legislation that most people missed. Any electric vehicle using batteries from what they call foreign entities of concern, including China, cannot receive federal subsidies. Sounds good, right? Except there's one tiny problem. Finding batteries that don't contain Chinese materials is virtually impossible. Ford had to cut production at their Chicago SUV facility because they couldn't get rare earth materials. Suzuki suspended production of their flagship Swift model for the same reason. These aren't small companies with supply chain problems. These are multinational corporations with sophisticated purchasing departments, and they still can't find alternatives to Chinese suppliers. What does that tell you about how deep this dependency really goes? But wait, because this story takes an even more sinister turn when you look at what happened in April of this year. China imposed export controls on 7 critical rare earth elements, not as a trade war move, but disguised as environmental and national security policy. They didn't ban exports. They created a licensing system that allows them to decide exactly who gets access to materials and who doesn't. It's economic warfare with a legal veneer, and it's devastatingly effective. The immediate aftermath was chaos. European suppliers reported production line halts after exhausting their inventories. Multiple automotive and technology companies had to scramble for alternative sources that simply didn't exist at scale. But here's the part that should keep you awake at night. This was just a warning shot. China demonstrated that they could cripple Western manufacturing whenever they choose, and there's virtually nothing America or Europe can do about it in the short term. Now, you might think the solution is simple. Just find other suppliers, right? Well, here's where the story gets even more complex. Japan is trying exactly that, partnering with India in a $400 million investment program to develop alternative supply chains. The European Union passed something called the Critical Raw Materials Act, setting targets to source at least 40% of processing domestically. America is throwing money at the problem through the CHIPS Act and various defense initiatives. But none of these efforts address the fundamental issue. China has a 20-year head start, and they've built the most sophisticated, integrated supply chain in human history. Let me give you a concrete example of just how sophisticated their strategy really is. When Malaysia discovered significant rare earth deposits, what did China do? They offered to share rare earth separation technology, essentially giving Malaysia the tools to process their own materials. But here's the catch. That technology comes with strings attached. Malaysia becomes dependent on Chinese expertise, Chinese equipment, and Chinese supply chains. It's not colonization in the traditional sense. It's something far more subtle and far more effective. Meanwhile, China is playing carrots and sticks with every country on Earth. Nations that maintain good relationships with Beijing get preferential access to materials and technology transfers. Countries that align too closely with American interests face export restrictions and licensing delays. It's economic diplomacy at its most ruthless, and it's working exactly as designed. But here's what really should concern every American. This isn't just about electric vehicles anymore. The same materials that go into EV batteries are essential for wind turbines, solar panels, data centers, and every piece of clean energy infrastructure. China has positioned itself as the gatekeeper for the entire green energy transition. Want to fight climate change? You have to go through Beijing. Want energy independence? Sorry, you're dependent on Chinese supply chains. It's a checkmate move that took decades to execute, and most Americans still don't realize it happened. The recycling angle is particularly fascinating, and it reveals just how far ahead China is thinking. While Americans are just starting to consider battery recycling, Chinese companies like GEM already operate 13 automated recycling facilities with annual capacity exceeding 50,000 tons. They're not just controlling the front end of the supply chain, they're building dominance in the circular economy too. By the time American recycling infrastructure is operational, China will have another decade of experience and technological advancement. Sodium-ion batteries represent one of the few potential escape routes from this dependency, and guess what? Chinese company CATL has the most advanced sodium-ion technology in the world, with batteries that can charge to 80% in 15 minutes at room temperature. Even the alternatives to Chinese technology are being developed by Chinese companies. It's like trying to escape from a maze where your opponent designed every possible exit route. But here's where the story gets really wild, and this information comes from internal corporate documents that most people never see. American companies are quietly preparing for what they call supply chain weaponization scenarios. Major manufacturers are building strategic stockpiles, developing alternative sourcing relationships, and in some cases, completely redesigning products to avoid Chinese materials. These aren't public initiatives. They're private insurance policies against economic warfare. The Pentagon has been running war games on exactly this scenario for the past 3 years. What happens if China cuts off rare earth exports during a military crisis? What happens if they restrict lithium processing during a confrontation over Taiwan? The answers are classified, but the fact that they're running these simulations tells you everything you need to know about how seriously the government takes this threat. Corporate America is starting to wake up to the reality, but slowly and often too late. Tesla is trying to reduce cobalt usage in their batteries. Apple is investigating recycling programs to create closed-loop supply chains. Ford is partnering with Indonesian nickel suppliers to avoid Chinese processing. But these are individual company responses to a systematic national strategy that China has been implementing for 2 decades. Here's the really disturbing part that connects everything together. China's control over these supply chains isn't accidental. It's the result of the most sophisticated industrial policy in modern history. While America focused on financial services and software, China identified the choke points in future technology and systematically gained control over them. They studied American vulnerabilities and exploited them with precision that would make Sun Tzu proud. The implications go far beyond economics. Military analysts now worry about what they call peacetime surrender, where America gradually accepts Chinese terms on everything from trade to foreign policy simply because we can't function without their materials. It's not invasion, it's dependency so deep that resistance becomes economically impossible. But here's what nobody talks about in mainstream analysis. This dependency is already changing American behavior in ways most people don't recognize. Why do you think American companies are so careful about criticizing Chinese policies? Why are universities reluctant to conduct research that might anger Beijing? It's not just about Chinese markets anymore. It's about supply chain access that keeps their operations running. The timeline for developing genuine alternatives is measured in decades, not years. Building processing facilities requires specialized equipment that mostly comes from China. Training engineers requires expertise that China has spent 20 years developing. Creating economies of scale requires demand that China can undercut whenever they choose. Every step toward independence faces obstacles that China either controls directly or can influence significantly. So here's the synthesis that recontextualizes everything you think you know about American power and Chinese strategy. This isn't a trade war or economic competition in any traditional sense. This is the first resource-based technological siege in human history, executed with patience and precision over multiple decades. China has created a situation where the more advanced and green America tries to become, the more dependent on Chinese supply chains we become. They've turned our own environmental goals into a weapon against our strategic independence. The question isn't whether China will use this leverage, they're already using it every single day. The question is whether Americans are prepared to pay the price for genuine independence, both in terms of higher costs and slower technological progress. Because that's the real choice we're facing. Accept permanent dependency on a strategic rival, or sacrifice short-term convenience and profits for long-term security. Think about your own situation right now. How many devices around you contain Chinese processed materials? How dependent is your industry on supply chains that flow through Beijing? How prepared would you be if those supply chains suddenly became unavailable or prohibitively expensive? These aren't hypothetical questions anymore. They're the reality every American business and individual needs to start planning for. The question I need you to answer in the comments is this. Knowing what you know now about the depth of Chinese control over these critical supply chains, what are you personally prepared to sacrifice to break free from this dependency? And what industries or regions do you think are most vulnerable to this kind of economic leverage? Because understanding this isn't just about being informed anymore. It's about survival in an economy where the rules of competition have fundamentally changed forever.